The word that I like to use with any of these things where we're talking about our time is either focus or being intentional, right? And I think that's what we're talking about here with these habits. Sarah Gale's talking about the weekly check-in, which I love, or the daily interaction. But to get very practical with that, and Sarah Gale mentioned this as well. I mean, this is what happens in our day-to-day lives. We get busy with our own worlds and what's happening in our career or what we're trying to do with our own personal fitness or any of these things. And we're still trying to have this very significant folks in our lives, and creating those intentional connections, whether it's if you're able to have coffee together in the morning before you run off into your day, or if you've got kids at home and you finally got the kids to bed, then maybe it's just a little quiet time to decompress together. Anytime that you can create those intentional opportunities to connect as a couple is just, I mean, that is the root of effective communication, is just getting that quiet, focused time. And it's not always quiet, but focused time together is just such an important part of, and being intentional about it. I can't overemphasize that enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to ask, thinking about entrepreneurs, because your question about, hey, how is my spouse doing, or how is my partner doing? How am I in my relationship? I think about it as an entrepreneur. I'm always thinking about that question in relationship to my clients. How is my client doing? And, to be honest, it's because I want to take care of my client, because I know that if I don't, they will leave.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with your marriage, but we don't necessarily think about that. Like, or maybe there's certain, I guess, beliefs that we have as a society that prevent us from just saying, well, I'm just going to leave because you made me unhappy. But the reality is that partner has a choice, right? They have a choice. And if we're deciding to spend our time somewhere else and not, nurturing that relationship, that plant that can't move, but our partner can. Do you find that couples or people in relationships recognize that before it's too late? Or is it one of those things where you have to wait until it's really tested, until people know about that?
Yeah, I think it's both, Hugo, because I meet with a lot of couples, unfortunately, that are dealing with infidelity. And the fascinating thing is, after it comes out to the surface and now they reach out to me, they describe their previous maybe like 2 weeks, and they're like, we've been more open than ever before. Like, we've been more intimate. Like, we have been so raw. And it's this like high that they're on, because it's like they've been broken so much, and trust has been broken so much that they almost feel like there's nothing to lose. And so now they finally start talking and sharing the things that they've always wanted to share, but that they've swept under the rug. Now it's like a honeymoon phase, which sounds weird when we're dealing with affairs, but we see that it doesn't last, of course, because then we start looking at the real situation. But the point is, I think that some couples, something has to happen before they get to a place where they realize what they're about to lose. And I think even in reality, what I like to try to get couples to understand is that, sure, your spouse might not walk out and leave you physically, but goodness, they will leave you emotionally. And that's one of the most lonely places you could be in a marriage, where you're married, but you're roommates. There's not that connection. You're raising the kids. Oh my gosh, even thinking about that, I have an emotional reaction, because that is an area where you don't get to experience the synergy of marriage and the adventure and the joy or anything good. You're just kind of existing.
I want to dig into this and spend a little bit of time here, because I know people. I've been in this situation myself, and I know people who are in this situation. And if I had to put money, if I had to bet all my life savings, I'd bet the majority of the people who are going to listen to this are in that position. I think there's a minority of people who are kind of like already at that point where it's an emergency and I need to do something. And there's an also minority of people who are early on in catching it. I think the majority of people are right where you're describing. So I want to spend a little bit of time, and I know it can be a difficult place to spend time, but let's describe that, because I know it, right? Like being in a relationship where you're emotionally disconnected. First of all, how do you recognize it, and what are the first steps? Just like, let's say you're listening to this, you're like, oh man, that's me. What do I do first?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that reaching out for help at that point. So there's a couple of stats here. So one stat is, I believe Gottman, marriage researcher, talks about 6 years is the number of years couples go before they reach out for help. 6 years of trouble before they reach out for help. And so at that point, when they reach out for help, it is difficult, but at that point, the marriage is so discouraged and toxic that there's really, I don't think, anything else to do other than reach out for help, and let's just see what can happen, what can be loosened up, and what growth can occur. Ideally, we want to look at preventative measures, because when it gets to the point where you're already in that scenario, there's a lot of habits, like what we're talking about, that have been built. There's a foundation that has been established that seemingly is not serving your marriage at that point. So if we can look at it, and this is why I love working with premarital couples, because that's when we get to start fresh and start getting these communication skills and tools in place. Because the ideal, this is another stat, which I don't have it precise, but it's this thought process that couples who are happier that actually address the issues early. And so it almost is like, oh, well, we don't want to nag. So this happened, so we're just going to let it slide. But over time, more slides. And it's almost like you're not being true to yourself. And then fast forward 15 years, this is true. I see couples like this all the time. It's like, well, I've always felt like this. I just haven't said anything. And so now we've built this whole thing that isn't what we want it to be, because we never took the time up front early on in marriage to say, hey, no, like that makes me uncomfortable or whatever. Let's address that. So I would say the best medicine is to catch it before we get down this pattern. But if you're already in this area of discouragement, you know it, reach out for help. And then we need to try and create something new in that relationship. But even that, it's a process, and that's where the belief and the desire to work comes in, because it's hard to undo habits. It's easier to build habits than I think it is to undo. And that's what we're looking at that stage.
Okay. So, and Jeff, I want to get your input, and I'm going to transition from this into focusing on the strengths of your partner. And the reason I say that is I believe, and what's worked for me is in times where my relationship wasn't as strong, one of the things that I noticed is I was always focusing on the negatives of the relationship. It's almost like this momentum that would build up. So I want to talk about how do you reverse that in the midst of it, and then focus on the strengths. But before that, Jeff, I wanted to hear your thoughts and even any questions that you have, directly.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask Sarah Gale as a follow-up question. So you'd mentioned the premarital counseling, which sounds like a wonderful, proactive idea. What are the top couple of things that you tell, couples before they actually take the plunge and get married? What are you advising them to do proactively and before they take that step?
Yeah. So I advise them to look at themselves and the relationship honestly. And so I give them an assessment, and they go through, and it measures a lot of things: communication, history, all of that. So it's pretty robust, because what we have to recognize is when we're married, we're literally marrying someone that is completely different from us. And that realization, although obvious, is very helpful, because then we understand why we see the same thing differently. And rather than being upset with one another for having difference of opinion, we understand, oh, that's just because from your background, your upbringing, where you're at, that's why you see it that way. And then we can understand and get a fuller picture of something, whereas before we only came at it with our own perspective. So that's one of the things. Awareness is huge. And I don't shy away from the tough questions. And if I see red flags, I'll just ask. I won't put a judgment on it, but I'll ask, oh, so what do you think about this? This person has 4 kids and the baby's daddies are still in the picture. So how will this look? So I'm going to ask, because those are real things they're going to deal with. But then I try and instill some things. And this might be where I'm a bit different than other maybe premarital counselors, because I'm already trying to teach them things. Like, I'm not just focused on make you aware of, this is your past, roles. This is what, we want the guy wants to do this role, the girl, we do all that. But then I also want to teach them strategies of communicating in a way that is effective, because that's huge. Like if we know how to argue well, if you will, then we're not going to avoid the conversation and sweep it under the rug. But then also we want to know our background, because we want to know, are we not as likely to engage because what we saw growing up was very toxic? We want to know that because we want to do something different in a marriage that we want to be different. So I don't know if that answers. So awareness, communication, I think are top of mind for me, Jeff.
Yeah, those are great. And just to be really vulnerable here, like and my folks are still married after 55, almost going on 60 years. But one of the things, so I wasn't raised in the toxic. I was actually raised in the, like, I didn't have a model of where conflict. So like you just said, learn how to argue well, right? And I felt like going into my first relationship, I wasn't necessarily equipped. I was more of a stuffer, right? So stuff the bad stuff down, and anyway, that didn't end up being productive in the long term for me, but that's what comes up for me when you mention that right there. So it was the opposite of toxic, but still, I wouldn't say that I was super well equipped to what you called argue well.
Yeah, I don't think most of us are.
Yeah, and so, okay, looking back, and we're talking about even premarital situations, but even going back to the situation of people kind of living in that environment where it's not as healthy, how do you start getting out of that? And even for pre-marriage, how do you start looking at your spouse's strengths? And really, obviously pre-marriage is a little bit easier. You're getting married. You're focused on what you like about. Yeah, exactly. This is probably the easy part, but in a way where it can last, right? Not the superficial. And I'll give you an example. Like sometimes, you may marry somebody because you like the way maybe they look or they behave, but then there are deeper things about who they are as a person that if you were to latch onto early on, would endure past that honeymoon phase where you see who they really are, if that makes any sense. So what are tactics to focus on the strengths?
Yeah, I think I love awareness. I know that I keep saying awareness, but recognizing that your partner is imperfect, because a lot of times we get married and, like you said, Hugo, it's rose-colored glasses, and then you realize, oh my gosh, their feet stink. This doesn't happen in fairy tales. I've never seen a fairy tale where the prince's feet stink, And so I think as we realize the reality that they are imperfect, just like we are imperfect, that's going to go a long way. Marriage is very vulnerable because you see the best of someone and you see the worst of someone. You see that person who says, oh, I'm going to lose 10 pounds. And then, months happen and they don't. And so then what? Then how do you view them? Is that respect still there? And so we have many examples where we see this in marriage. But speaking of strengths, it's really focusing on what is something that you can appreciate. What's the gratitude? What is the word of appreciation that you can give? And I have couples do this consistently. When couples work with me, they are tasked with verbally appreciating their spouse daily. So then when I see them the following week, I say, how did you personally do? I'm not interested in how their spouse did, because we're not keeping track. And that's another thing, where when we exist in a transactional relationship where it's like, well, once he tells me I'm awesome, I'll tell him he's awesome. That just sets us up for failure, because we're not always on. So I think when we're thinking about strengths, it's focusing on, okay, yeah, what are their strengths and how can I speak that over them? Because I think we forget sometimes that our spouse is in the world as well. Like they deal with difficult situations and they can get beat up in the world. And so to come home and have the person who knows you the most, knows the worst of you, but still speaks life over you and can remind you of those unique things that maybe they would only know, that is a confidence booster. And that helps you kind of take on the world and recognize, okay, at least I got one person that's got my back.
That is an excellent example. That's something we do in Team 212. And I want to actually go back to what you said earlier about doing things because you're checking it off. And that it's very important to be intentional. This is something we do in Team 212, the daily appreciation to your spouse. And one of the things about that daily appreciation is it can become like checking it off, or like saying like, oh, I did it 7 times and you did it twice. Why aren't you giving me my appreciation?
Yeah.
And the reality is it's about us building our habits to and you said awareness. I like the word just to see those things, because like our reticular activating system, I was just talking to my wife about when we bought our SUV. As soon as we bought that car, now they're everywhere. Now all our neighbors have them. It was there all along. It wasn't until I started, verbalizing it or seeing it. And it's the same thing with that gratitude, the awareness of what our spouse's strengths are. So that's a great example.